I'm Linda Jackson and I'm from Food Focus, and welcome to our Friday Fundamentals session. Friday Fundamentals are supposed to be fun, but they're also supposed to be fundamental, where we talk about some basic concepts relating to food safety specifically. And joining me today is my colleague Adele Kroch. Adele, welcome. She's joining us from Paris. How are you doing today, Deli?
So that I don't do the same mistake as you, I'm doing wonderful. Thanks, Lynn. Excited to be part of this chat this morning, and hope that the attendees will have all their questions ready and realize that I will unmute them shortly, or we will unmute them shortly, so that they will be able to ask, the questions during the Q&A session. And yeah, looking forward to hopefully putting some answers to some questions.
Absolutely. A few weeks ago, you would have been part of our discussion regarding a certificate of acceptability. This was really a great webinar because we were able to interview some environmental health practitioners from my local municipality, which happens to be Ekurhuleni, and we were able to get some day-to-day insights from them of some of the challenges that they face, but more importantly, some advice in terms of how to ensure that when you apply for a certificate of acceptability, you do so in the correct way, and what is the procedure to follow. Now, for many of our inquiries on our website, we often have a conversation with people about what's the next step? Where do I go from here? And very often the question is related to being a retail supplier. So how do I go into the retail channel? What do I need to do to ensure that I am ready for retail when it comes to food safety? So we thought that we would take this opportunity to talk about that and to give some insight as to what is the next step, why is it the next step, and how should you go about making the decision regarding what is your next step? Because ultimately there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It really does depend on your business activities. So I like pictures. For me, the easiest way to explain a difficult concept is to make sure that I understand what the requirements are with regards to ensuring that I can break it down and I can understand how exactly things work together. So I'm going to show you this picture, and hopefully it will explain to you how we see food safety going forward with regards to the retail environment. So if you have a look at this picture, I'd like to show you it as a timeline. And so the timeline is, for all intents and purposes, a 3-year timeline. And we are looking at the reason for the 3 years being linked to the GFSI capacity building program, which I'm going to tell you about a little bit more about shortly. But importantly, what we want to highlight is the progression with regards to food safety requirements. So if you have to look at this scale being in relation to time, and then if you look at this scale being in relation to increased food safety requirements, or increasing difficulty, if you like, of food safety requirements over the period of time from your start of your food safety journey to kind of being at the point where you would be acceptable to retail. So if you have a look here in the corner, your starting block, which is literally at time 0, would be your certificate of acceptability. You should not be trading as a food handling organization unless you have R638 certificate of acceptability in place, and that is the basic legal requirement for you to be considering as part of your food safety journey. Danny, some comments on that?
Yes, I think everybody always, the challenge is that they don't know where to obtain it. But I think our previous fundamental video that we made would definitely guide the people. But it's just to make sure that they do make contact with the environmental health practitioner based in the where the business is based within that local authority. I always say to the people, best thing is whoever you're paying your rates and taxes to, that's the your local authority. So it's to make sure that you get hold of the environmental health practitioner, and that's the way that you will make sure that you comply with 638.
Absolutely, and that's the start of the journey. And so where do we go next? Now, when it comes to the retail market within South Africa, there are a number of different options available, and we're going to talk in a bit more detail about these. But essentially, the progression which has been agreed by the major retailers within South Africa relates to the Global Food Safety Initiative Capacity Building Program. Now, this program has been designed to allow organizations to achieve what is ultimately the requirement for food safety at a retail level, and what's been agreed internationally, and that being a GFSI benchmarked certification standard. Now, on my diagram, I've used FSSC 22000 as an option for your benchmark standard. But what is important to remember is that this is not the only GFSI benchmark standard. The GFSI provide a set of criteria which they use to audit other food safety management system standards. And if those standards meet the benchmark requirement, they are then adopted or approved as the equivalent standard for food safety at ultimately the level which is acceptable to retail around the world. Now, FSSC 22000 is one of those standards, but please bear in mind there is also the BRC standard. There is the IFS standard, which is a French and German standard, and there is the SQF standard, which is predominantly an American standard. So I think what's important here is to bear in mind that this is the final goal if you're wanting to supply retailers, and very importantly, if you're wanting to supply retailers in other parts of the world. This is not necessarily the goal for some South African retailers, but if you're wanting to export your product, it's having to play with the big boy rules if you want to play with the big boys. So we'll come back to that a little later in the presentation, but that is our ultimate end goal when it comes to food safety and meeting the retail requirements worldwide. Now, to go from 0, which would be your 638, to hero is a very big jump. And hence the capacity building program was introduced. How can we get a small and less developed supplier? We always refer to her affectionately as Tannie Cook Sister or Sister Samusa. But the small, less developed business, how do we get them to get to this point? It's too big a jump to go from 0 to hero. And so the GFSI have arranged for 2 other stages which allow you to, through a stepwise progression, finally achieve certification. And so we refer to these as the basic level of GFSI capacity building and the intermediate level of the GFSI capacity building. And what's important is that your progression is supposed to take a period of 3 years, although those rules could be dependent on the retailer. The final destination is also up for discussion, depending on which retailer you are supplying. Some retailers within South Africa are happy that you achieve an intermediate stage. Others are happy that you achieve a basic stage. But there are a number of provisos. One of those would be, what kind of product are you supplying? What is the risk associated with the product? So there are a number of factors that go into the decision. As I said, unfortunately, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but what is important is we should all be on the same path, going somewhere. We shouldn't be on a different road. We should all be working towards the same end goal, ultimately. So if we take these requirements, I'm going to come back to the GMP, but if we take these requirements, I think what's important to appreciate is that they are almost equivalent to some South African standards. And so I've given you a number of websites here. Remember, the recording will be available, so we'll be able to share this information with you. But if we have to take our basic level, it normally is within the slightly above the legal requirements and would include your basic prerequisite programs. And in South Africa, the document that we would use as a reference or a guidance document here would be SANS 10049, and which is the requirements for prerequisite programs within South Africa. The intermediate stage would then require you to have a formal HACCP system in place, and so here we would need to use 10049 as well as 10330 if you're looking at the South African context and wanting to use reference documents to help you to understand the requirements on the basic and intermediate checklists. What's important to appreciate is that there are requirements at basic level which do impose a certain level of HACCP. You are expected to do a hazard analysis. In other words, even at a basic level, you should have an understanding of what hazards are, what could go wrong within your process, and a basic level of the control measures. You're not required to have a full CCP program in place, but you are required to have done a hazard analysis even at the basic level. So you can see we're moving stepwise up into the progression and looking at the benchmark standard ultimately. Now, Danny, I know that you are very, very passionate about the first level, which is food safety culture. And, you know, from your perspective and your experience, why do you think we should have food safety culture at the bottom of the pyramid? Because many of the GFSI benchmark standards have now only added this recently, but we feel as an organization, it's actually a foundation. It's not a final destination. You should start in this area first.
Absolutely, because for me, it is, if you are going to start the process just with the idea of, I want to get my product on a shelf, and so I need to pass an audit. So your thought process immediately starts with, I just want to tick boxes, you know, and I'm going to do the quickest thing, get a consultant, you know, do this for me quickly. But you as a company have not decided fundamentally that you are doing it because it's coming from your heart. It's coming from, you want to make sure that you have the passion in your system, in your program, with your people, to make them aware right from the start. This is not about ticking boxes. This is not about you know, just making sure we pass an audit or anything to that effect. But this is all about, we're going to build it with the passion and with the love of making sure that we all understand why we are doing, you know, what we are doing in terms of putting our product on the shelf. So the whole concept of making everybody involved from the beginning, making sure everybody understands what it means to go through these steps, you know, from basic to intermediate to you know, your certification. The whole thing of keeping the people together, making them understand why it's being done, making them part of it, and not only, you know, it's a decision, one person gets appointed, you need to drive it, you need to make it work. No, everybody right from the start is involved. And for me, that is the culture, the food safety culture of how are you introducing to your staff how you're going to do food safety. You know, we always say it's that part, what everybody at heart knows and do without anybody watching them. So yeah, absolutely. For me, I'm very passionate. You know, you have to make sure that that decision is taken on the, you know, on all levels for the business.
Yeah, and I think, Danny, you're talking here from bitter experience where, you know, you've actually worked with companies where they haven't had the right attitude towards food safety before starting, and the rest of the journey becomes extremely painful, and the staff fundamentally know that management are not really committed to food safety. It's all just about ticking the boxes, and that's not going to be a sustainable system going forward. We do need to have the consumer's best interest at heart. I think what's important is that everyone has to run a business. Everyone's trying to make money. And so it's not as though we're excluding that profit motive, but it's ensuring that we are running a profitable business while always doing the right thing when it comes to food safety. And so I think that's a very important.
Yeah, but you know, for me, that points on what you've just mentioned now. If you're not going to start with understanding why you want to follow this process or why you want to go, the route, you're actually going to cost yourself more money. Because then suddenly when a buyer from a retailer tells you, okay, but you actually need now, to have a system in place, and you then think, oh, okay, I'm going to, get a consultant or get someone external to help me, instead of him or the person, the owner of the premises, first understanding what he is supposed to do or she is supposed to do, and then determine if it's not possible to do it internally by training people and building your capacity within your own company, than always looking, on the outside. So I always say, to people, if they phone through, you really, if you want to save money, you have to plan properly. You have to have the idea, where are you working towards?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that involves bringing someone on board who will manage food safety within the organization, somebody who will be responsible for the documentation and the systems, not responsible for food safety, but responsible for the administration. And I know often we have a conversation, there's always an argument there, oh, we can't afford it. But like you say, if you actually plan properly from the beginning, you can land up saving yourself, a lot of money in that regard. Now, if we look at this process, I have said that this is potentially the non-retail process. In other words, if you're supplying product to large manufacturers in South Africa, in other words, you have an ingredient, many of those customers will be happy with this process. So they may not require a GFSI benchmark standard. They may be quite happy for you to stop at SANS HACCP. In other words, you don't need to go to ISO 22000 for HACCP, but you could stop at SANS 10330. Some customers who may have international links, large manufacturers, may require you to go the extra step. So they're not satisfied just with our local HACCP standard, but they would need you to look at a GFSI benchmark standard, in which case you would be looking either at the BRC or at FSSC 22000. So then this diagram would look a little different in the sense that at this level for PRPs, we would need to look at ISO 22002, the relevance part of ISO 22002, depending on whether you're in farming or whether you're in catering or whether you're in manufacturing, because the PRP part of FSSC 22000 is specific to the sector of the food industry. For your HACCP document, you would then be looking at ISO 22000 instead of SANS 10330. And then, of course, if you are going to tackle one of the GFSI benchmark standards, please bear in mind that they all have additional requirements. And so there we start to see the picture look a little bit like this, where you've got TACCP, VASCP, plus other requirements. And almost every year, the GFSI benchmark standards or scheme owners bring out an updated version of their additional requirements, which means ultimately we never really get there. Food safety is always evolving, and some of the elements that they're adding are even not completely related to food safety. Food fraud may not always have a food safety implication. So biosecurity, those kinds of programs are not necessarily always related to food safety, but we're starting to look at a holistic, responsible manufacturer when we look at the way the GFSI benchmark standards are going. So just important to bear in mind and to summarize that the progression will take you from legal compliance to the basic level, then to the intermediate level where you will require a HACCP system, and then on to the final benchmark standard. Okay, so we've had an interesting question in relation to the diagram, and that is, we have a number of additional schemes within South Africa. So if you go to any certification body, any auditing company that is recognized by the FSI, what's important to bear in mind is that when you get to this level, FSSC 22000, the benchmark standard, you must be audited by an accredited certification body. So this cannot be a private auditing company. They must be an accredited certification body. So please, you need to bear in mind that when you select the company that you're going to work with, if you're going to stay with that company for your entire journey, please choose right from the word go. Now, many of the certification bodies in South Africa can offer the basic, intermediate, and the final GFSI benchmark standards, and they could offer you a range of these different benchmark standards. It's up to you to choose which one you would like to engage with, and we'll talk about why in the last slide. But there are other auditing protocols that they could offer you. And what's important is you need to understand whether these are acceptable to your retail customers, and also where do they fit in? What does this document ultimately give you, and who will accept the document or the certificate that you were given? So there are a number of auditing companies in South Africa that are offering a GMP audit program. Now, this is slightly above legal requirements and not quite basic. So you're just out of the starting blocks. It looks at many of the physical requirements within your facility. There's some very basic documentation that's required, but it is referred to as a GMP audit. Please bear in mind that this is not acceptable to all retailers within South Africa. So you need to think strategically. If you're wanting to provide product only to, for example, ShopRite, this may be an acceptable audit protocol. But make sure you check with the customer before you make your final decision. Now, the question that we've been posed is, well, what about the FSA audit? So many of you may be familiar with the FSA audit. It's predominantly provided by Intertech within South Africa. There's a long history to the reason behind this, but where does that particular audit protocol fit into this progression? Well, if you had to take it and you had to compare it to the standards, it probably fits somewhere over here. It is past the intermediate requirements. It is more comprehensive than the intermediate requirements, but not quite all the way when it comes to FSSC 22000 and the additional requirements. Now, what's important about this is the question is this FSA audit GFSI benchmarked? And the answer to the question is currently it is not a GFSI benchmark standard. It is currently acceptable within South Africa. It is acceptable to most, hear me carefully, most South African retailers, but not all. And so again, please make sure that when you engage with your retailer of choice, that you clearly understand what are the rules of the game, because it is a commercial arrangement. It is not necessarily only a food safety driven requirement. What's important to bear in mind is if you consider or you are considering supplying Woolworths, for example, Woolworths have their own specific internal requirements, and if you're going to provide them as well as another retailer, you will have to comply with 2 sets of requirements. And there is some overlap, but I think the important thing to bear in mind is that the devil is in the detail. So you need to be very, very clear on what the requirements are for both the retailers or all the retailers that you are engaging with, and you then will need to comply with all of those requirements. And hopefully they won't contradict each other, but please bear in mind that there may be some specifics that each retailer would like you to comply with, and you're doing this for commercial reasons, not necessarily for food safety reasons. So hopefully that helps answer your question, Verona. When it comes to where can I find the documents, how do I know what I'll need to be audited against? Well, for the capacity building program, all of the checklists are in the public domain, and you can access them via the My GFSI website. Alternatively, within South Africa, we have the Food Safety Initiative, which is a program that is run by the Consumer Goods Council of Southern Africa. Again, these documents are in the public domain. You can go onto the website, you can download them, and you can start to prepare for the audit process of your choice. What's also important from the FSI process is they will explain to you what is the procedure that is acceptable to most of the retailers within South Africa, so that you understand what is the next step. I've downloaded the checklist. Now what do I need to do in order to be ready for the audit? Because ultimately that's where we're heading. We're heading to an audit which will then give you the green light for consideration by the retailer. Please hear me carefully. Just because you've passed the audit does not mean the retailer will necessarily just take your product. There is another process whereby the buyer must be happy with the product. They must feel there is a need for the product on the shelf, and so there's a whole commercial conversation which is not part of our discussion today, but it is obviously something that you need to be, very cognizant of, because what you're about to embark on is going to cost you some money, and so we do want to make sure that your investment is going to reap the benefit of actually getting product onto the shelf, if that's what you really want at the end of the day. Deli.
Yes, Lynn, and I think what's important also to remember at that point is that, am I right to say that at least you need to have documentation with 3 months records? So all of this must form part of your process to understand what is nice, like you said, those downloads that you can get from My GFSI. They've got all the checklists there to help you and to assist you so that you understand, what the people, if you want to go for certification, or if you do get an external auditing company to come and audit you, that they want to see how you've implemented it. So it's very important that from the start, you set up your system and always take note of it, that there's going to be a question from someone coming to your side. Okay, show me, explain to me is fine, but I want to see it that you have implemented and done it. So I think this slide that you're going to go through now is just going to further explain what I'm trying to say with that.
Absolutely, Del, because I think this is often a mistake. I've had phone calls myself where, a supplier is desperate. The buyer's interested in their product, but the buyer's told them that they need to have a food safety audit done. And there's often a misconception that this is just an inspection, that you're going to come and have a look at my facility, and, if my walls and floors are good, we're good to go. And often it's quite a challenge to explain to the supplier that there needs to be evidence of a formal food safety management system in place before the audit. As you say, you need to be able to demonstrate with evidence that you manage food safety on a day-to-day basis, in the same way as you manage your stock. In the same way as you manage your cash flow, making sure that you've got proper orders, proper receipts of goods when they arrive, so that you know what you owe your creditors. The same kind of management system that you would put in place for your money is the kind of management system that we need to have in place for food safety. Those goods that you are receiving, are you checking them to make sure they're not infested? Are you checking them to make sure that they're not damaged? Are you checking the temperature when you receive, milk or meat, for example, to make sure that it is at the acceptable legal temperature before you actually bring it into your facility? And can you prove, or can you show evidence rather, that this is happening every day, not just the day of the audit? It's got to be part and parcel of the day-to-day business activities. And this is often a challenge for smaller companies to understand, because they think that they're, doing the right things, and in many cases they are, but they lack that evidence, the component of the evidence, and they also often lack the formalization of their processes. Their processes are in someone's head, which is great, unless the person gets run over by a bus. And we need to try and explain to them that there is a need for a self-sustaining system that doesn't depend on an individual's knowledge only, but there is some continuity and risk management built into those processes. And that's really what these standards are about. If you look at the basic standard and the intermediate checklist, they're starting to take smaller organizations down this path by introducing supplier controls, receiving controls, the need for training programs, the need for testing of your products on a regular and sort of scheduled basis. And so as you go through the progression, so the requirements start to become more and more formalized in order to allow the development of the food safety management system from a good idea through to a formal system that shows due diligence. So if we look at this diagram, it really simplistically tries to explain the steps that you will take once you have selected where you want to land up. So if as an organization you are predominantly supplying large manufacturers within South Africa and not the retail sector, and your customers are happy with you achieving SANS, HACCP, then you're going to choose that standard. You're going to then go on some training, because it's really important that you know what you have to do. And just reading the standard, unfortunately, doesn't always allow people to have a good understanding of what they need to do. Because the standards are generic, there's a need for interpretation. And that's where the training component is useful, because a company that is a technical expert can assist you in the understanding of how you would implement the words that are in the standards. The next step is to really establish the minimum level of documentation. So it's not about creating a paper monster, but all of the standards, whether it's basic, intermediate, or a GFSI benchmark standard, do require some level of documentation. So you've got to understand what that is, and you've got to put it in place. And so you could land up with, for example, a personal hygiene code of conduct. All the standards require some level of rules for your employees. And these rules should be documented, they should be available to the employees should be trained on them, and there should be evidence of all of these processes. So we've got to start by writing it down, and once we've written it down, we then have to train people on what we've written down. The next stage is probably the most challenging, and that is the implementation of what you've written down and trained your staff on. And again, when it comes to the audit process, we can't audit until we've got evidence of implementation. It's not about writing what you're going to do, it's about writing what you do and have done. So the evidence that would be looked at during the audit is of implementation, not of intention. We've got to see that the system is functioning and is effective when it comes to food safety. So it's only, as Adele said, after at least 3 months of record keeping, 3 months of implementation, where we would be able to actually assess whether or not the system is functioning correctly. And even 3 months can be a little soon. So then you could apply for your first audit, and at that audit, it is likely that you will have some non-conformances that will need to be, actioned. Sometimes a company gets through the first time. In other words, they've done everything and are doing everything that they're supposed to be doing in accordance with the basic or the intermediate checklist. But often there is a situation where you have to implement corrective action, which might mean the auditing company would come back to re-audit those areas of concern. At that point, if they're comfortable, you would be awarded with the certificate based on the standard that you're being audited against. You could then submit this certificate to the retailer, and then what would happen is you will go into an annual audit cycle. So the auditing company would sign a contract with you, and they would then come back after a year to come and reassess how has the last 12 months of implementation gone. Have you maintained the system? Because that's obviously what we would like to see. Food safety becomes a day-to-day business activity. Tell your comments.
Lynn, I think what jumps out to me, if you look at the slide, why is training there twice? And I hope that, the audience would understand the reason why it's there twice is because if you don't train your staff on what you are doing and why they're going to do, it's going to be a grudge process all the way through. Because you can see here now, it is very difficult if it's, a task that's just given to one person to work through this process. Everybody has to be in it because, like you've said, if you've now set up something, like you used the example of the temperature, that means it's someone at receiving that would need to complete a document. So if that person is not trained properly and explained to why he needs to actually take the thermometer and take the temperature and put it on there at the time that he's doing the action, and understanding where it fits in the whole process to, at the end of the day, to support that you will pass an audit, then it makes it very difficult, because then it makes the QA or the person that's responsible for the food safety's life so difficult, because they look at documentation and then they come at the end of the week and this the documentation is not completed, and then what happens? Everybody quickly sits and they fill in the numbers and the temperatures, and it's such a waste. It's a waste of ink and paper, because at the end of the day, if you get an audit, they will pick it up and it will be written up as a non-conformance. So that's why the passion and the drive and the understanding of implementing this system has to be from the bottom all the way through everybody. You used also the example and said, how people plan their budgets and finances. And they put a lot of passion in it, because that then determines if everybody's getting bonuses and all of that. But for your food safety is exactly the same. Because if you decide to go onto this route and you put in all the effort, but you don't put in the training, you are going to waste your money.
Absolutely. And I think it's also leading by example, because often we can land up in a situation where employees are expected to do certain things, but managers feel that they don't have to do those things. And, a classic example is always wearing protective clothing. You can have, everyone has to wear, hairnets, and then the manager walks in without the hairnet. And I think that's what you're saying also in terms of making sure that this is not just a paperwork exercise, but it's actually a behavioral exercise where we're doing the right thing, and not just writing down the right thing or filling in documents, but we're also doing the right thing, on a day-to-day basis. So that is simplistically the process that you will follow once you've chosen where you would like to land up on my food safety requirements, graph. Now, I think what's important is where do you want to land up? So, Stephen Covey says that you begin with the end in mind. So So you've got to do this when it comes to food safety as well. Where do I want to end up? And most importantly, why? Why do I want to be at that point? If you as an organization decide that you're going to implement a GFSI benchmark standard, we've got to know why. The whole business has to understand why, because it's an expensive process and it's going to take a lot of time and effort, so it has to be worth that investment. Now, what I'm saying is that you don't necessarily have to have a GFSI benchmark standard to produce safe food. Hear me clearly. If you've got a company that's got the right attitude, the right food safety culture, and they're doing the right things every day, that having the certificate or not having the certificate is not going to make a difference. I've worked with organizations that have the certificate, but I still question the safety of their products because of the attitude and because of the culture within the organization. So please, just having the certificate doesn't automatically mean that your food is safe and that everyone's on board for food safety. But it's your choice at the end of the day. So if we take the retail sector and you decide that you want to become a retail supplier within South Africa, you have to answer a few questions. Who do you want to supply? Which retailers do you want to supply? Are you going to want to supply to a few stores, regionally, nationally? Do you want to supply house brand products, or is it only your own brand? Because the answers to those questions will impact on your choice of end point on that food safety requirement criteria. Are you wanting to export? If you're wanting to export, you know that the final destination is going to be a GFSI benchmark standard, and you need to be prepared for that, and that needs to be your final destination. Now, you could be making these decisions for other reasons. In other words, you are wanting to keep up with your competition. And so your competition may have a GFSI benchmark standard. You want to be compared on the same level, in which case you're embarking on the journey because you want to be seen to be competitive when it comes to food safety. In other cases, you might be wanting to be the market leader. Your competitors are at an intermediate level. They're happy with being at an intermediate level, but you want to go the extra mile and you want to be seen to be the market leader. Then you're going to make the decision for strategic reasons, not for food safety reasons necessarily. If you decide as an organization you want to supply multiple retailers, then you need to bear in mind that you may have to comply with multiple retail standards, and that will include multiple retail audits. Not all of the retailers are prepared to accept just one certificate, and that will mean you will still be subjected to several audits. Now, this is not for food safety reasons. You're now making this decision very consciously for commercial reasons, and you need to bear that in mind. You're signing on the dotted line, and with that comes a number of consequences, and it's got nothing to do with your food safety management system. It can be frustrating having multiple audits, but you need to bear in mind that this is now from a commercial perspective. Okay, so I think at the end of the day, this is really what we wanted to highlight to you. We wanted to show you the progression. We wanted to show you the options that are available. And so now it's really over to you, in terms of any specific questions that you may have in relation to your particular situation, where you are at the moment, and why you've made certain decisions about your food safety management system. So I'm going to open the floor. Are there any questions coming from you guys that you would like us to chat about? We'll be very happy to answer them. If not, then we'll just make the recording available to you so that you can, look at it in your own time and perhaps discuss it with your team. If you'd like to pop through your questions now, you're welcome to type them, or you're welcome to put up your hand and Adele will unmute you so that you can chat to us.
I'm sure that there must be one question that the audience would like to ask us. Is there anybody that's going to raise their hand or ask?
Oh, it looks like we've done a good job. It looks like we must have answered everyone's questions perfectly, which is great.
Absolutely, which is great.
Okay, super, guys. Well, thanks very much for joining us then. It's been great to have you. And we sincerely hope that it's